In April, at least 5 boats sank in the Mediterranean, killing approximately 1,200 people. They died trying to migrate to Europe, many of them having fled war-wrecked countries like Syria. The international media reacted with shock. Even the Wall Street Journal ran the story on its front page. La Repubblica calls it the apocalypse of the migrants. El País is aghast at the horror in Europe. Corriere della Sera mourns that they drowned dreaming of Europe. Yet although these newspapers would appear to be saddened by the deaths of migrants, and although they appear to have a minimal respect for the dead, the detail of the coverage overlaps with the policy goals and justifications of the European politicians, and in effect works to dehumanize and delegitimize migrants. To see how this works, we need to look at the background of migration from North Africa to Europe. As such, migration is far from new and has taken place at much higher levels in previous decades. Most migrants came to Europe to work. Some came seeking refuge. Today, just under half of the migrants who make their way to Europe in this fashion claim asylum when they get to their destination. Now, most European governments are signatories to the UN Convention relating to the status of refugees, and so their safe passage ought to be assured. Yet it is incredibly difficult to get into Fortress Europe by those means. Apart from all the legal obstacles, even refugees face a policy of illegal pushback according to the European Council of Refugees and Exiles, wherein Greek government forces illegitimately use violence and threats to prevent those seeking asylum, many coming from Syria via Turkey, from entering the European Union. If they go through Bulgaria, they are locked up in prison camps. They live on miserly rations of food in what Amnesty International calls cruel and inhumane conditions, and live in fear of racist attacks. If they try to cross from Morocco to Spain or from Libya to Italy, they risk sinking to their deaths in the middle of the Mediterranean. As Al Jazeera reported last year, the number of deaths in the Mediterranean Sea is rising. Over 3,000 in the first 9 months of 2014, the worst figure since the beginning of the century, adding to the total of 40,000 who CNN report have died like this across the world since 2000. A humanitarian catastrophe. Most of the bodies are never recovered. The ones that are usually don't have documents. No one knows who they are, even what gender the deceased are in most cases. Why do so many die on these boats? Politicians blame traffickers. Yes, the boats are tiny, unstable, and overcrowded. The traffickers who profit from immigration controls seek out the cheapest transportation. But as the International Organization of Migration points out in their detailed report tracking lives lost during migration, there is more to it. Yes, there are growing pressures from some war zones, creating new flows of refugees, but there has also been a drastic ramping up of border controls, and this partly explains why the rate of deaths is drastically increasing in the Mediterranean while decreasing in other parts of the world. In recent years, the response of the European Union to the growing number of deaths has been to implement something called Operation Triton. As the BBC reports, this is a maritime border patrols program in which the enforcers of Fortress Europe traverse the Mediterranean Sea looking for migrant boats in order to deflect their journey. The EU also demands that North African states help obstruct refugees. Recently, for example, the Moroccan authorities brutally destroyed the makeshift camps which had been built for migrants near the Spanish border, as reported by The Guardian. And even if these migrants ever get to their destination, such as Lampedusa in Italy, they can end up being kept in facilities where conditions were, reports Corriere della Sera, compared by the local mayor to a concentration camp. The response of EU politicians to the latest crisis ranges from alarmism to downright thuggishness, an instance of the latter being British Conservative politician Michael Portillo, who, reports The Mirror, said that the surviving migrants should be rounded up and dumped on a Libyan beach. More typical, though, is the reaction from Prime Minister David Cameron, who said, as reported on the BBC, that we need to go after traffickers, help stabilise these countries. Likewise, the BBC reports that the Italian Prime Minister has condemned trafficking as the new slave trade. At the same time, reports Reuters, he is begging for more European intervention to stop the migrants coming. French Prime Minister Hollande responded not chiefly by expressing sympathy for the migrants, forced to travel in unsafe conditions to flee war zones, but by saying, as reported in Le Monde, that the smugglers were terrorists and that Europe needed to ramp up Triton border controls. In each case, the politicians are making a number of assumptions. First, that the problem is migration. Second, that traffickers are the nefarious party. And third, that the cause of migration is state failure and poverty in Africa. But what of the European media which shapes discussion on this issue? In truth, although seemingly sympathetic to the deceased, the coverage works to support the approach of the politicians. For example, Le Figaro's front page laments, "Refugees, Europe powerless in the face of the tragedy." Thus, the role of migration controls imposed by European states is ignored, and they are instead represented as victims of an overwhelming problem. It is very rare in the European media for anyone to point out, as did Heribert Prantl in the Süddeutsche Zeitung, that it is EU policy and not primarily traffickers or anything else that is killing refugees. Or take the front page of the German newspaper Die Zeit, which ran with the decidedly narcissistic front page, "We don't want them to come. We don't want them to drown. What do we want to do?" As if the issue was the troubled conscience of European racism and the only debate about how to dispose of those unwanted people with the minimum of moral friction. In fact, much of the European press coverage and punditry is concerned with the problem of how to reconcile the EU's barbaric immigration policy with what Angela Merkel referred to as European values. For example, Paddy Ashdown's Financial Times article, flexing his moral indignation muscles over the drowning of immigrants, he nonetheless concludes by demanding that Europe put more pressure on African countries to control migration better. The coverage is also sensationalist. Now, this is partly because the European media has always been obsessed with those migrants travelling by sea, which is supposed to provide a natural territorial defence. For example, last year the British press went crazy about the efforts of a few migrants to get to the UK by sneaking onto a passenger ferry at Calais. Calais was besieged by gangs of immigrants, reported the Daily Mail. The truth is, most migrants to the EU don't travel by sea but by air. As Frank Duvel of Oxford University points out in an article for the London School of Economics, the majority of those migrants, now deemed illegal, had legal status when they first arrived and subsequently lost it. They came to work where there are existing labour shortages. But for the European press, this is a boring story. They have only two ways of looking at migrants. They can either be treated as pitiable and helpless victims fleeing poverty and war, used by traffickers, desperate, but ultimately too much for Europe to take on. Or they can be treated as invaders, as criminals, and bearers of foreign and unwelcome cultures. Rarely are migrants treated in the media as dignified human beings seeking to live and work and performing a socially useful purpose. Take the example of the German daily Deutsche Welle, which faults African media for ignoring the crisis of migrants travelling. Why? Because the assumption of the European media is that this is an African problem. Likewise, the French television network France TV Info blames chaos in Libya for the waves of migrants heading to Europe. Thus, the problem is not Europe's pointless, perverse and sadistic anti-immigration measures, but the hopelessness of African countries. Indeed, the ramifications of this purported invasion have been spelled out in the right-wing French newspaper Le Figaro, which ran a number of articles in the same month that the worst deaths were occurring as a result of Fortress Europe's immigration controls, portending the coming European civil war and the collapse of democracy as a result of insufficiently well-guarded national borders. Ran a number of articles in the same month that the worst deaths were occurring as a result of Fortress Europe's immigration controls, portending the coming European civil war and the collapse of democracy as a result of insufficiently well-guarded national borders. Perhaps most despicable of all was a column by the popular British provocateur Katie Hopkins, who openly aped the language of the far right in a column for the right-wing tabloid The Sun. She described immigrants as cockroaches, swarms, a plague of feral humans spreading like the norovirus. She advocated using gunboats and threats of violence to repel migrants and suggested drilling holes in the bottom of anything that could carry migrants across the sea, presumably in the hope that more people would sink and drown. This article was so appalling that it incurred a denunciation from the United Nations. The UN statement, reported in The Independent, quoted Hopkins' incitement and urged the UK authorities, media and regulatory bodies to take steps to curb incitement to hatred by British tabloid newspapers, in line with the country's obligations under national and international law. But the truth is that when it comes to European values, both the relatively civilised liberal media and the vulgar reactionary press have their uses. While the likes of Hopkins contribute to the lynch mob atmosphere in which refugee deaths are less of a problem than refugees, the liberal media also tends to misrepresent the problem in a way that exonerates the EU. One final example of this. The EU has now, following up on Hollande's suggestion, tripled funds for Triton, its border patrol operation. This will make life harder and more dangerous for migrants. Lucky then that practically all media, from RTE to The Guardian, agree that this is really an increase in funding for humanitarian search and rescue operations.